I will just say a broad welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining. And welcome to this panel called Ecofeminism, Social Ecological Justice. And I'm very excited to hear all of your contributions, and hopefully we have a fruitful discussion. And the topics of these contributions are ranging from performance art, feminist hacking, climate crisis, contamination, to speculative fiction. I'm very happy to introduce the first panelist, Megan Mo Beitix. Do I pronounce this correctly? The last
It's Beitix, but thank you.
Beitix. Okay. She's an artist working with associations and dissociations of culture-nature structures. Today, she will read a selection from her recently published book, Performing Resilience for Systematic Pain. And through a broad range of interdisciplinary practice and theories and a series of first-person interviews, she aims to tackle the following question. How might performance serve as a means for facing ubiquitous trauma and pain in humans and ecologies? So we are very much excited to hear and discuss these potential answers to these questions. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And I'm super grateful to be in dialogue with you all. And so thanks so much for having me. And I look forward to chatting. So I have a couple of images that I'll share as I go. So as was mentioned, this is from the book Performing Resilience for Systemic Pain, which came out via Routledge. It's absurdly expensive, institutionally priced, so get your libraries to order it. And this is from chapter 4, which is called Category, Stigma, and Listening. Each chapter of the book unpacks a chapter of the work that I created called Systems and Pain / Networks of Resilience. So the book itself kind of an unpacking through what could be called an artistic research lens of different approaches to these different questions through research and the actual making of the work, as well as my own experiences and inner monologue. So the first few slides are a linear reading of the chapter, and the last 2 slides are sub-excerpts in and of themselves. So just so you know, what I'm writing is not whole hog the whole chapter, but just chunks, basically arranged for hopefully your efficient enjoyment. Anyway, here we go. So listen, I go to the customer service counter. I approach the luggage rack. I cross the lobby. I put my luggage in the overhead bin. I rest it on the floor next to me. I look in my backpack, my pocket, my shoulder bag that looks like a purse. I'm not looking at anyone. I have my back to you. I'm looking you right in the face. Excuse me, sir, you say. And ironically, I'm suddenly acutely aware of the day, time, location, your gender, your race, your clothing, what I'm wearing, how I'm standing. There's not usually anything significant about the moment, but my brain scans the scenario regardless. It's happened when I've had long hair, when I've had short hair, before I've spoken, after I've spoken, at all times of day, but most frequently at transportation centers, so much that a friend jokingly referred to it as my bus gender. It's happened at least once when I was wearing a long coat and a skirt. I could speculate endlessly about how and why it happens. Because I'm tall. Because I move with a kind of harumph about me, as opposed to, say, gentle swerves. Because I'm not skinny. Because I used to be more aggressively genderqueer, using my presence as a monkey wrench to the binary, deliberately confusing people about what they thought they knew. And now I just enjoy wearing pants and being myself. Many things. You correct yourself with a sorry, ma'am. Not because I correct you, not because I asked you to. I might not have missed a beat, but because you take a minute longer to look at me, or I speak. I look at you with what I hope is a nonplussed expression, but which I'm sure carries a subtle tension of scrutiny. Anyway, you take a minute and reevaluate your assessment, and we both go about our business. It's okay, I say. Happens all the time. It's been happening on and off for about 20 years. The Box Gallery in Illinois, Galesburg, Illinois, located on Kickapoo, Peoria, Sauk, Meskwaki, Bodowadmiaquin, Miami, and Sioux territories, shared a space with a wallpaper company. They didn't call themselves a wallpaper company. They referred to themselves as wall coverings. Maybe because it's not strictly paper anymore, or their offerings go beyond full pattern plasterables. Their inventory was nostalgic and retro: flowers, sailboats, plaids, raised patterns, stripes. Their website listed various categories of wall coverings: country, kitchen and dining, florals, stripes, the vaguer traditional and transitional, and finally, kids and masculine. When I first saw it, I nearly spit my tea. The border section had categories for girls and guys as well as masculine, but no feminine. Were wall coverings meant to be feminine or non-masculine by default? In the world of domestic wallpaper, did only men and younger folks have gender? Where I grew up, dude was a gender-neutral term. Could there be a dude wallpaper? Would it evoke non-binariness, California beaches, or bearded beer-drinking men in bathrobes? The masculine section contained a few gendered tropes: bricks, logs, sailboats, and some patterns that were both refreshingly and questionably out of context. Santa Fe stripes, like someone had taken a desert paintbrush to khaki. A Navajo medallion pattern, because indigeneity is masculine, or because access to indigeneity is synonymous with white male explorers. We're likely assuming everyone who buys wallpaper is white, and associating Navajo culture with men, or a masculine Western trope. I went into the shop. I asked for the masculine section. They weren't arranged by category in the shop, but by number. Shelves of rolls of wall coverings. I described the wallpaper, they found it. I'm using it for an art piece for the show next door, I explained. And also, I asked, inhaling sharply, can you tell me why this is labeled masculine? The owner looked at me, stunned. He shrugged. Like, are there any specific qualities about it that read masculine to you? I'm just curious, I asked. It's just masculine, he said, shoulders up near his ears, as if it were obvious, as if the question itself were uncomfortable, unexpected, even rude. Know that sense of the obvious. It's a conflation of projection, experience, and social conditioning with observable reality. It's a failure to really see or listen, which Jonathan Sayer described as a point of frustration for recovering veterans. It's upended every time someone tells me, sorry, ma'am. I bought 2 rolls. In her book, Slow Looking, an examination of observation across disciplines and histories, Sherry Tishman notes, there's much we can and should do to learn about our own biases and appreciate the limits of our own knowledge, but we can't not have a subjective viewpoint. Installation 1 went up in the Knox College Box Gallery in Galesburg, Illinois. The wallpaper went on the wall in charcoal smeared strips, held down in places by black cloth gaffer's tape. I had one of the wood panels from Nebraska with me, hung on that wall, along with framed quotes from research and interviews, scrawled in black charcoal. In the space in front of the walls, I put a dining room table, the classic heavy wood kind, round, with the center leaf removed. On one half of the table, a jar of ashes and oranges on the floor below the table, piled in a corner at the base of a lamp. The lamp's power cord ran along the wall in big swoops over the wallpaper, between the framed words, held in place by hinges and hardware. A smoky trail of blended charcoal ran along its curves. Also plugged into this cord were 2 digital frames, which screened short videos in a looping rhythm. They played video clips from the performance in Nebraska. The interview voices in the video were subtitled. The words appeared as part of the video. Audio description from both videos floated into the space, sometimes clearly audible by themselves, sometimes overlapping with one another. In performance and its studies, ideas of embodiment come up often. In acting, performers embody characters. In making performance art, the bodies of the performers have material meaning. Bodies mean things. Invariably, identity presentation becomes a crucial issue, within which gender is a critical concern. So we come back to Butler, who perpetually revisits ideas of performance and gender from multiple angles in her work, in a considered expansion of performativity. And she, quote, performance is always an action or an event that involves a number of people, objects, networks, and institutions, even when performance takes place without a stage and in the briefest of moments, gathered up and dispersed in evanescence. For it is how and with someone or some set of non-human things and movements, always relying on a ground or background, or social world, a fleeting act for a passing crowd, that performance comes forth as performance at all. Even when infrastructure fails, something or someone takes up some space, pointing to that loss. So performance is not the self-constituting act of a subject who is grounded nowhere, acting alone. If performance brings a subject into being, it does so only in terms of the social and material coordinates and relations that make it possible or that form its scene of intervention. Gender is one of many things that is not fully separate from its community, context, network. In the same way that will and pain are not ours alone, our identities are not just solo performances of expression, but part of a network of cultural influences, social norms, and punishments, materials with gendered and racial connotations, layers of self that are something other than those signifiers. This is not necessarily how performers, however, are consistently perceived. In narrative works, a person is written as behaving a certain way consistently, as best suits the storyline. The character is an essential component of narrative theater and filmmaking. It's how we understand stories. If she tumbles in the first 5 minutes, she's going to be a klutz, or she'll be tripping again at a key moment. At the very least, the fall is going to have some monumental significance that tells us about the time and place we are in, and who this person is who is falling. It is never just falling. And while many a hardworking actor has lent complexity to roles that have themselves been written with complexity, the character can still be a flattening structure. Miguel Gutierrez, a performance artist whose work is challenging, complicated, and aggressively defiant of norms, sums the complexity of expanded performance practices up wonderfully in describing his own relationship to character in performance. Quote, "The notion of character disinterests me because it suggests an integration, a united self, or a representation of a person. Instead, what fascinates me are the nuances and fluctuations of a turbulent self, the way someone is and is not simultaneously, the multiplicity in any given body, and the virtuosity it takes to change states, approaches, actions in the blink of an eye. I see character as useful when it becomes a door to the plasticity we have as channelers of various versions of ourselves. I am always suspicious of solidity. I get nervous in a performance when someone appears to have no critical distance from his or her attempt to authentically be one thing," end quote. The demand to authentically be one thing, specifically a thing that is subservient to a story, extends even to objects. A dramatic principle of Chekhov's was that a gun introduced in the first act needed to go off by the final curtain. That is, if an object wasn't going to explicitly serve the plot, it didn't belong on stage. Like a tree, only valued for its healing properties or the quality of its wood, ignoring the value of the oxygen it produces, the nutrients its leaves add to the soil, its entanglements with other trees, lichens, animals, and bacteria. To reduce a thing to its singular role or value is a drastic disservice to the thing itself in its own right. We are not singular entities. We are ecologies of self. So, people are complicated. Wallpaper appears not to be. It is a flat paper with an adhesive backing on one side and a design on the other. It is bereft of the whole extra layer of biological sex. It reproduces creatively and industrially, not by some orifice or appendage that connects to another wallpaper species and which might be confused with gender. But it does create ambiance, mood, space, and those things can be heavily gendered. What's tripping me up about the gendering of the wallpaper is that the pattern seems to be totally absent of anything might stereotypically connote masculine in Western culture. No logs, no bricks, no what? Plaid, stone, axes, guns, angry social media, naked, muscular, oversexed bodies. Even the predominant color, a muted yellowy beige, doesn't point to anything much except warmth. Its labeling as masculine renders both the framing and its usual signifiers absurd. Here is Butler again. Genders, then, are neither true nor false, neither real nor apparent, and yet one is compelled to live in a world in which genders constitute univocal signifiers, in which gender is stabilized, polarized, rendered discrete and intractable. In effect, gender is made to comply with a model of truth and falsity, which not only contradicts its own performative fluidity, but serves a social policy of gender regulation and control. End quote. In cultures with heavily Western normative understandings of gender, and being real, race, sex, disability, etc., to exist outside the norm on any level is to suffer an endless scrutiny, a perpetual questioning of personal character in the real life sense of virtue, wisdom, and personality, often to emotionally or physically violent levels. In these social contexts, character as a means for evaluating the reliability of a real-life non-conforming person is considered in terms of integrity, but actually has a closer relationship to a fictional entity. What's being scanned for is not actually moral dependability, but a kind of social avatar, a consistency within visual, verbal, and social paradigms. The signposts of integrity are inevitably tied to gendered signifiers. What it means to be reliable, consistent, dependable is first predicated on what the expectations are of those gendered norms. Scrutiny and punishment are performed both verbally and non-verbally. Integrity is evaluated by often irrelevant parameters like skin color, clothing, or the consistent use of valued words, or strictly according to social conformity. Observing and listening are key to opening up avenues for trust, emotional safety, empathy. To be heard and understood is a fundamental human need. The first action that mental health first aid responders are asked to take to support someone in a mental health crisis, after determining whether they are harm to themselves or others, is to listen attentively and non-judgmentally. Listening is the emotional equivalent of a tourniquet, of CPR, of an ambulance, of saline hydration. It's a time-tested emotional bandage, as vital as water. This is, of course, not news to many cultures, especially not to women and marginalized communities, who have historically done the emotional labor for many privileged classes. Adrienne Marie Brown writes, "In my experience, healing happens when a place of trauma or pain is given full attention, really listened to. Healing is the resilience instinct of our bodies, a skill we unlearn as we are taught to pay for and rely on data and medicine outside of our own awareness to be well. This is pointedly important, as artist Kenya Robinson reminds me, in a reality where Black people aren't heard, aren't believed, and when they speak the truth about anything ranging from their life and work experience to whether or not they are holding a gun. When we aren't heard, aren't seen for who we are, by anyone, but especially by people who we care about or who hold power over us, we may not only be unable to avoid trauma, we might be unable to fully resolve our pain. The pain is part of ourselves, our daily experience of the world. Being heard is healing. Feeling listened to and understood changes our physiology. Being able to articulate a complex feeling and having our feelings recognized lights up our limbic brain and creates an aha moment," writes Bessel van der Kolk. I wonder what this means for my wallpaper. I wonder how I listen to it. I wonder how it would even define something like pain. As I wrote this, Candor Arts and Sming Sming Books premiered This Is Not a Gun, a book that features contributions from artists, each creating a visual, written, or poetic response to objects that have been mistaken for guns and used to justify the deaths of Black people. Systemic racism distorts the perceptions of the privileged. It removes the observer from the present moment and separates them from the greater reality of the object. It turns wallets, hairbrushes, cell phones, canes, and umbrellas into guns. Everything, as Elaine Scarry writes, is a weapon. In this context, Black people are the subject of torture, with bodily injury and death as the result. In My Grandmother's Hands, Menachem spends a large portion of the book writing about police bodies and the importance of training officers on identifying trauma, calming and settling their own bodies, and staying present with their bodies as they move through experiences. Observation becomes not just a useful tool for healing, but an essential means of preventing harm to others. Oppression is traumatic. Trauma is a disruptive, severing force. Description is not just one means for getting us back to the present. It's a way to hold folks accountable for their actions, to keep us in the moment of things as they exist beyond the limits of our projections, expectations, and bigotry. It is flawed and limited, manipulatable and distortable, and so points more to the urgency of a particular set of intentions than a specific formula. The intention to approach people, things, ecologies with full presence. The intent to genuinely listen, to observe, to live in self-awareness and the limits of our own perceptions. The intention to understand that things present in our observations include racism, misogyny, homophobia, and the blindness enabled by systemic inequity. To not regard our individual self as so wholly and singularly objective and independent that we value it over the lives of others. To understand the difference between intention and impact and work to close the gap between them. I am constantly misgendered, but my race is never mistaken. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Megan.
Yeah.
Thanks for also sharing this very personal insights and merging into your artistic practice and your narrative about how a wallpaper and how it is labeled can really coin or trigger so many associations. And I was yesterday talking to a friend of mine who is working as a tailor in the theater, and there they have like 2 rooms, one for tailoring clothes and dresses for women and the other for men. And right now there's a play going on about queer bodies. So where do you put these people in these boxes when it's come about dressing those? And inside the theater, inside this tailor section, they had like a huge discussion, which is like insane, because in academics, but also in the museum, for us, it's like obvious that we're working with queering bodies, and it's such an like obvious thing to do. But in theater, when you have something on stage, people need to think first where we have now to dress you in order that you can go on the stage, which is pretty crazy. And it remembered me when you talked about this wallpaper. Do you need to buy it? Why you want to buy it? And what does it mean if you if something is being labeled in that way? What does it mean for your work if a material that you're using is being gendered, basically? What I find pretty crazy. Does someone has any questions to Megan?
I have a question about the title of the book, if you want to explain that.
Yeah, I guess. So part of it is just like a remix of the title of the project, which was originally Systems of Pain / Networks of Resilience, which is kind of too long for a book. So my editor was like, let's rethink this. So I basically gave her like 50 different options, and this was one of them that we liked. But I think part of why that particular framing is I do a lot of unpacking my own whiteness in the book and its relationship to the work, and a lot of discussion about processing internal pain and holding space for others' pain. Like listening and observation are really kind of persistent themes throughout the work. Yeah, kind of trying to look at that both from a social and a creative process context, really using performance as a term that exists in the center of the Venn diagram between real life and art. So thinking about performing resilience is something that that we take on both as artists and as humans in communities. And trying to re-examine kind of what that means. Like, I think I talk in different points where it's like, you know, historically in my community and generation, performing resilience means pretending like nothing's wrong, essentially. And, you know, playing it being unaffected by essentially whatever is happening, which ends up being turns out a pretty unhealthy response on a number of levels. So kind of trying to open up this question of like, okay, where and how do we make space for the pain of others, knowing what we know about how essential that is to the human process, and how does performance uniquely open up insight into approaches and spaces and structures for that. Yeah, so I hope that makes sense.
Thank you. Was the space that you showed the exhibition also activated in a way? Were there also like performances happening inside, or?
So this particular iteration of the work, like the actual digital frames that you see looped a documentation of a previous performance. There are a lot other chapters of the work were like video or live performance or site-specific performance. But here, part of why I get into the wallpaper is a kind of persistent question for me at the project, is how the objects are performing or how the materials are performing. I get really weird about the wallpaper in a different section of this chapter of just like, you know, like knowing that it's absurd to ask certain questions about like, does wallpaper feel pain, or what would the wallpaper's idea of its own gender be? But that being kind of the logic of, you know, certain ideas of animism, non-human agency, vibrant matter, that sort of thing. So I kind of like to sit in that space between the knowing that you're being absurd and genuinely taking on something anyway, just to see what happens. Hope that makes sense.
Thanks a lot. I think we will find some topics, similar ones, in the next panel by Stefanie Wuschitz and Tagui. Please tell me how I pronounce your name correctly.
You pronounced it very well, thanks.
Okay. So both of them will speak about feminist hardware, building techno-ecofeminist circuits as an artistic practice. I'm super happy that you're here. I will quickly introduce both of you. So Tagui is an artist, curator, and researcher based in Vienna. She's working at the intersection of hacker-maker cultures, feminist, new materialism, relational art and pedagogy, and post-human ecologies. And she's a PhD candidate at the Academy Fine Arts in Vienna. And Stefanie works at the intersection of art, research, and technology with a particular focus on feminism, open source technology, and peer production. And they will both present a work in progress on feminist hacking, which is an international art-based research project by the Austrian Science Fund and hosted by the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna. And it proposes a strategy and method for empathetic, eco-sentient, decolonial, and anti-racist action in the field of art, science, and technology. Sounds super exciting. And does everything work now, Stefanie?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm really sorry. I'm performing a different gender by being Yusuf Kurniawan at the same time, like myself. I just did that for technical reasons because I want to share my screen. But I think maybe it would be better, Beatrice, if you can share our slide.
I have it open. I will share it.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
No worries. You see it?
Yes.
Yeah, just let me know if I should continue.
Okay. Is there a full screen? Yeah, there's a full screen Vollbildmodus.
Yep.
All right, so I will start. Taga, are you okay with?
Yes, yes.
All right. So my name is Stefanie Wuschitz. We are 3 people in this research project. Patricia Reich is at the moment in Portugal, but she is also a postdoc in this arts-based research project. And Taga, do you want to do the introduction or should I do that?
I can take on from there.
Okay.
So to speak a bit about the introduction, here we go. We're developing electronic parts, such as sensors, resistors, or PCBs from ubiquitous, sustainable, and upcycled materials, as well as biodegradable matter, using only decentralized, fair-traded, modular, renewable, and non-toxic materials. Since 11 years, we run together a feminist hackerspace based in Vienna called Miss Balthazar's Laboratory, which is rooted in a culture of feminist resistance, activism, and the interdisciplinary domain of.
Can we have the next slide, please? Sorry, can we have the next slide, please?
I will try again. It didn't work out.
Maybe I can try it from my screen too. Oh yeah, thank you. And then also,
is it too far?
No, it's fine. Maybe I always send you a message in the chat. So
Okay. Yes.
Saga.
Thank you. So we're working our activities are rooted in a culture of feminist resistance, activism, and the interdisciplinary domain of feminist technoscience. This way, we try to map the alternatives to sexist, toxic, and extractivist commodity chains through artistic research. But to start, what is feminist hardware? How do we understand it? Feminist hardware is a strategy and method for, as we already mentioned, empathic, eco-sentient, decolonial, and anti-racist ways of making hardware for artistic purposes. Our approach stems from feminist hacking practices, which is an intensive knowledge sharing process through workshops and other forms of exchange, as well as do it together and open hardware movements. Feminist hacking is structured around breaking with feminine gender scripts, transgressing gender norms, and embracing technological challenges. This usually involves disassembling electronic devices on purpose with the intention of learning and understanding, but also reassembling them into something else and creating art. It implements recycled hardware, and it is informed by critical making. Feminist hacking is about developing artistic technology based on open hardware from a queer and female perspective. And where are we grounded from the theory perspective? Following Rosie Braidotti, by thinking of ourselves as in this together, we can truly engage in practices not harmful to, but in line with the very figurations we live with and work on reciprocal understanding. Karen Barrett also includes molecules and nanoparticles in her account when she explains that matter and meaning cannot be dissociated. From an entangled state of agencies, we seek to understand how our own situatedness comes to matter. Hence, our approach is grounded also in Jane Bennett's notions of vital materialism, Braidotti's views on feminist new materiality, and Barrett's diffractive approach, which all frame differences as crucial, reaching conclusions, asking to be drawn, and always changing, lacking in essence and lacking a final stage. Differences are like waves diffracting with other waves, sometimes canceling each other out, but in a different phase, exponentially emphasizing each other's amplitude. Conflicting tendencies, interests, and growth, therefore, are equally never graspable, never easy to be judged, yet we can swing with their ever entangled and communicating iterations, like troubling rhythms. Haraway reminds us one more time that staying with this trouble is the method to get the closest empirical gaze on what is real. Similarly, hacker practices from Ghana, Mexico, and Indonesia resonate with hacker practices from Germany, Greece, Canada, and other regions of the world. For feminist hardware, this entails being, also staying on the move, not giving into fast solutions, but instead iteratively performing vitalist connectivity. Art historian Susan Witzel argues that to determine if and how interdisciplinary collaboration between art and science produces new results, it is important to examine the character of the interaction, where the goal must be to establish and prove the relationship, as well as to assert the distinction between art and science. At the same time, hierarchization and stereotyping should be avoided, as they frequently reduce art to the position of explanatory illustration, silent visual transmission, or a welcome element of havoc in multidisciplinary environments, whereas science, on the other hand, is seen as the custodian of research. To avoid such attitudes, Witzel suggests thinking with three philosophers, Gilles Deleuze, Gilbert Simondon, and Karen Barrett. Namely, she proposes Gilles Deleuze's idea of free difference and his elaboration of Simondon's concept of individuation as a more constructive method of addressing the symmetrical and non-hierarchical interaction between art and science. Witzel draws a parallel between the indeterminacy of different relations from philosophy and quantum physics, as explained by Deleuze and Barrett, to assert the divide between art and science as a positive difference. Diffractive art practices to which we adhere have several instances. One is the application of the relational new materialist term agential which destabilizes the subject-object binary. Another instance is represented in the generative entanglements between media art and contemporary art practices, as the always already entangled practices of art emerging from the patterns of interference that are sometimes revealed through artworks. A diffractive interface is an approach centered on the relation between art and pedagogy as a method of allowing dynamic interaction through experiments with different relational patterns. Developing alternative representation and gesture movement within cultural interfaces becomes a catalytic space for interaction, a generative metaphor, aesthetic event, socio-material framework, and political device. Such a framework is a series of research tools that can destabilize the ontological violence of certain systems of representation and pre-established agents. It can also encourage the development of other ways of understanding the world and generating knowledge beyond the supremacy of reflective processes as a vehicle for the articulation of sensible orders. As a result, the interactions of the collective entity created in a learning setting manifest as a mutation into a metastasizable equilibrium, a false equilibrium that will be broken when any of the elements that compose it change. It leads to a condition of helomorphistic pre-individuation in which the focus is on the process of becoming rather than the ultimate form. When looking at the disruptive material effects of difference, diffractive art practice is an operative mode which functions at two levels. The first relates to the layering of media, and the second is affective. The researcher is entangled in the transcorporeal process of becoming minoritarian with the data. Engaged with the data, the researcher is aware of the body-mind faculties that record scent, touch, pressure, tension, and illicit association that emerge between matter and discourse. This concept of becoming minoritarian emphasizes a key distinction between diffractive and representational analysis, transformative and non-transformative inquiry approaches. Diffractive analysis generates the researchers and the investigated artists and artworks mutual unfolding or interaction. When it comes to design research, diffractive methodology is a way of revealing the computational materiality of feminist hardware and uncovering the role of embodiment in prototype crafting, which can redefine the approaches to human-computer interaction itself. Scurto and others outline 5 interference conditions for art-based ML prototypes, for instance, namely a situational whole, small data, shallow model, learnable algorithm, and some aesthetic behavior, which can be adapted to feminist hardware. In this way, the process of interactive feminist hardware positions materiality as an entry point for design within HCI. Small data, shallow models, and learnable maker skills may be used to create prototypes that yield unique aesthetic behaviors that can be experienced and debated by a variety of practitioners. Through diffractive practice, the socio-technical conditions obtained for crafting art-based feminist hardware prototypes open the way for an interactive understanding of feminist hardware that accepts disparities between design and engineering approaches. And here
I take over here, yeah?
Yes, to Stephanie.
Thank you. Well, we are a team of artists, and so I would like to introduce you to our process that we use to apply things that Taga elaborated on. Beatrice, could you go to the next slide? Our research question was, how can hardware not only be gendered and ungendered, but how can it be also made feminist and transfeminist? And we were thinking about the values that come from hacker culture and the ethics that come from hacker culture, and how we could apply it to hardware. So we made up this kind of materialist code of conduct of standards we would like to reach with hardware we want to use for arts. The hardware should be without sources that are from mining in harmful ways. It should be environmental friendly. The hardware should be produced under fair working conditions. And the hardware should be manufactured from ubiquitously available materials that everyone couldn't find around them. And hardware that is not generating e-waste. Could you switch to the next slide, please? So as you know, there are 4 conflict materials in the world that are almost in all the hardware we use, no matter if it's your phone or your computer that you're using now, or iPad. That's most of all gold, because it doesn't erode and it's really fast conducting electricity and signals. Tungsten, tin, kaolin, and tantalum. And can you please go to the next slide? They are materials that are really rare earth and cause a lot of civil war and a lot of military action and torture and horrible finance a lot of horrible conflicts around the world, and a lot of harm in the sense of contamination. So we would like to think or speculate about ways to have fair trade versions of these elements, and or find alternatives in the first place. Could you go to next? Yeah. So tungsten usually is used for drill bits and all kinds of things that need to be shielded. It's very valuable and toxic. Tin, also very toxic. You know it from soldering irons. Kaolin is almost in every material, PCBs and resistors, but mostly in ceramics or paper. Tantalum is usually in capacitors and chips. And gold, as you know, is in the PCBs as connectors. Could you go to the next slide, please? So we researched on fair trade alternatives. For tungsten, there's actually a lot of urban mining and recycling and upcycling of tungsten. One of them is a company in Austria, it's called Wolfram, which is the German name for tungsten. And on the one hand, it's a mine. On the other hand, they also collect old drill bits and a lot of old metal that is containing tungsten, and to recycle it. But of course, you can never recycle the amount of material that is demanded by the worldwide electronics industry. Then for tin, we found a group they're called Verlötet, and they are producing recycled solder. So it's the same thing, they're recycling from old PCB boards the solder, and selling them over really, really big platforms like Conrad. So it contains less toxic material and it's recycled. For kaolin, there's not much that we could find, but we will talk about what we did in the project in a second. For tantalum, also there are not so many places where it's coming from. I mean, Fairphone did a really good job in tracing the roots of contracts and subcontracts, because these commodity chains are extremely complex. And this research of knowing who is selling to whom is already a really big step. For gold, there's artisanal mining gold, where like farmers can farm on their own land, try to find gold on their own land, and they try to collectively sell it as fair mined gold. Around 80% of the people employed into the gold mines are small and artisanal miners. But still most of the production output is from big companies that only have, I don't know, 10 employees for one mine, because these big machines do the most jobs. Can you go to the, yeah. So we are trying to find arts-based, speculative, and kind of not totally sellable alternatives. We try to be open to things that could work in an art space to avoid these conflict materials. Can you go to the next slide, please? As we said earlier, we run a feminist hack lab, and the feminist hack lab in Vienna is supposed to be a safer space for doing things by yourself, learning by yourself about technology and being critical, and use peer production to come up with better ways of doing things. And also about do it together. We really believe in this kind of magic of people coming together to join forces. And can you go to the next slide, please? Yeah, and a lot of these different sets of values come together here. The open source ethics that are about being accessible to all kinds of groups. The eco-feminist set of values when it comes to sustainability. The peer-to-peer aspect, because we always do things in collectives and connected to workshops. And the DIY, mutual self-help aspect that we try to just, even if we're not technicians, obviously, try to build prototypes. Can you go to the next slide, please? Yeah, so our knowledge sharing platforms that for us are essential for feminist hacking are usually like workshops and meetings and exhibitions and scenes and manuals. Next slide, please. And we did a very big festival in the summer where we tried to invite all artists we know who do similar work on hardware, on ethical hardware. Most of them are biohackers. Next slide, please. Trying to substitute the usual toxic and rare materials with biomaterial, degradable materials. So we had many workshops. For example, this is Wet Lab from Spain coming to us. Then please, next slide. Yeah, they work a lot with contamination of cells in different nutritious bases. Next slide, please. This is Joanna Fremer-Moser, who tries to make alternative capacitors and transistors. And she actually really managed to build one with us in the workshop from completely different materials than the common industrial ones. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is the same workshop. Next slide, please. And then Erin Agrawal from Indonesia, she made also with us artificial leather from organic materials with a kind of fungi that grows on pineapple juice. Next slide. Yeah, and then we share this knowledge in different meetings internationally. Next slide, please. Of course, recently we couldn't meet that much, so we had a lot of collaborations online. Next slide, please. Our starting point is always to try to open this black box of technology and lose the respect for technology. I mean, this illustration is a little bit radical, but it's this idea of crash course, you know, really undo technology in order to understand what it does and how it contains all these precious materials that are being dumped usually into very toxic sites. Next slide, please. And then rebuild and reuse and really understand what it does and do artwork with it. This is the installation that Ulla Rauter did in our hack lab. Next slide, please. So now I would like to tell you what we try to do with the ethical hardware we found, or what we try to do to create ethical hardware, feminist hardware. Can you go to the next slide, please? So first of all, instead of the solder, the tin, we try to find other things that are conductive and can be used in circuits. And first of all, we use skin. And if you look at acupressure points and acupuncture points, you will find that it has a higher capacity of the skin. So it will ground the elements on an antenna quicker than on other parts. Can you please go to the next slide? So we created a circuit from the ethical hardware we could get in the industry, which was mainly wires and resistors and capacitors. So we tried to make a really simple circuit, but it's actually a capacitor sensor. And depending on where you put it on different acupuncture points in your body, the skin will conduct electricity in different ways. And you're kind of not only a variable resistor, but a variable capacitor. And we sonified that. So every user has a completely different pitch when kind of grounding their own acupuncture points. Next slide, please. And then we tried to find a way to substitute batteries. Next slide, please. So there's this thing they found like 2 or 3 years ago, that anaerobe bacteria, so bacteria that doesn't use air, but is deep down where there's no oxygen, they build like little networks among each other, and they use them as kind of wires to transfer electrons. So there's this concept of microbial fuel cells that are actually not batteries. They're really producing energy on the go. So they were actually never empty, but they are like pets. So you have to really feed them, and then they produce electricity. Next slide, please. So we tried that great cathode and anode with graphite felt and graphite sticks, and tried to feed these microbes and cultivate them. The output was not so great, but we did different workshops. This was one for people who with care responsibilities. So we did that in a public site between social housing complex, and a lot of kids and adults came to play with these fuel cells. Next slide. So we collected mud, and we added these cathodes and anodes with the graphite felt and put them in series to add the voltage that's produced to one value. Next slide, please. So I think it was interesting for everyone to see how difficult it is to come up with alternative energy, because it's not very high voltage. But on the other hand, it also gives kind of hope that things that can be alive can also be in a circuit that is reciprocity. Next slide, please. So yeah, here we just had 2 volts, one, at least one LED. Kaolin is more difficult to substitute because it's really, really important for everything that has to be binded somehow, everything that has to stick together. It's kaolin in there. Next slide, please. It's a powder, a white powder, and it's usually used for ceramics, but it's really in also resistors and paper and in packaging, everything. Can you go to the next slide, please? So it has so many forms of applications. Every surface and every paper has some in it. Next slide, please. And ceramics has in the human culture a very old tradition, of course. I mean, it's one of the first cultural forms of expression, ceramics and ceramic vases, and there's many aspects to it, because collecting ceramics was also a way of emancipation for women in the 19th century. However, it has, like most of these resources, a very evil background. Can you go to the next slide? These mines are actually really destroying the water resources, and there were a lot of mines in England and in Portugal, and the workers really had wars with the police to prevent these mines and the exploitation of labor in there. Can you go to the next slide? For example, in Barcelos in Portugal, for 20 years, people were resisting against the mine. Finally, they succeeded, and the mine company moved, but they just moved a couple of kilometers away and continued the mining there. And there's a really big water lag because of that. So we tried to also make ceramics without kaolin or with different kinds of materials, and we tried to make our own resistors, because resistors are basically just something very conductive and something that is not so conductive, and again, very conductive. But we had a lot of trouble with the melting point of these objects, so it's not so easy to make your own alternative kaolin-free ceramics and hardware. Next slide, please. So, of course, you have to always have very high temperatures, and that's not very energy efficient for making your own ceramics that are fair trade. The next thing we tried to tackle was gold, because gold is really very, very, very bad on so many aspects. Next slide, please. So this is the biggest copper mine in the world and the second largest gold mine. But what I'm saying now really counts for so many African countries or Eastern European countries. This mine was opened by the dictator of Indonesia after there was a coup d'etat that destroyed the Indonesian democracy. It was a very strong democracy after 300 years of colonialism. And this dictator was put in power through Western companies who wanted to get their hands on this mine. And actually, really, they didn't pay taxes to this mine. It was exported. The company who did the mining is in Arizona. So all the money, all the profit went out of Indonesia and was not only that Indonesia lost its democracy because of this export, but also it never got any profit, of course. It's like 2 years ago, there's a little bit of taxes. Okay, so we looked at this extreme surplus of gold that is here in the Western world versus the extreme poverty and the democratization that happened in many other regions. And we used these gold ceramics as switches. So we made like a tablecloth that has conductive parts, and depending on how you interact with the gold ceramics, you can interact in different ways with the sound. Can you go to the next slide? Yeah, we did the performance this way. So we tried to add gold or take away gold from the existing ceramics that have gold on it in order to reuse the gold that's already there and make it kind of a ready-made PCB. Can you go to the next slide? So this is the data sheet, basically, and a tablecloth at the same time, how things are connected. So people could drink and use the cup and the plate and the spoon as a way to connect plus and minus and connect signal to ground. Next slide, please. Yeah, we are not happy yet with the boards because the boards are not open source and a fair trade yet, but we're working on that. Next slide, please. Yeah, and during the performance, we also the sound was contextualizing this hardware background. Next slide. Yeah, that was the performance a month ago. Okay, so now I'm coming to the end. Our next steps are, sorry, can you go to the next slide? Our next steps are now to build a hardware kit for artists from all these materials we try to make in different ways. So to have a microcontroller in the middle, but different sensors and outputs from sustainable and fair trade materials that can be connected to the microcontroller and that live up to the standards that we said at the beginning, that they're fair trade, feminist, open source, and that they are kits that can be used in different ways. So can you go to the next slide? It will be kind of tiles. It's still not beautifully done, the lines. We will have to make more small lines. Next slide. And through connecting different tiles, we want to make it possible for artists to use our fair trade hardware in different ways in a modular form. Next slide, please. Yeah, so these are just prototypes. It will be much less gold. Next slide, please. We now have the technology working and we have the materials, and we just really have to bring it together. So now it's just a prototyping phase. Next slide, please. But it's working. It's just we just need to figure out the gold problems too. Next slide. Next slide. Yes, that's it. So if you want to be in touch, here are our email addresses. And the project is over in 1.5 years. So we hope that by then we can send every artist who has interest such a fair hardware, feminist hardware prototyping kit. Thank you so much for listening. Sorry if it was too long.
Thanks a lot. It was amazing. Super interesting. Are there any questions? Because I have a lot, but I think we also have still so many speakers today. So I also don't want to keep everyone wait, but I find it so interesting how you also created and do this deep research into all the materials, and your code of conduct that you had for the materiality. I think this is something that also museums need to face. I'm referring to museum because I'm working in one for digital art, and we also like thinking about how to conserve these pieces, basically, how to conserve digital art. And it's not even about like video art from the 80s, it's also from recent technology, who working with AR or whatsoever. And most of the circuit boards, the material itself, gold, as you just said, and in Indonesia, it's so contaminated of colonial practices. And also, how can artists like rethink which materials they're using, and how can also museums rethink how to store them, and how to also propel this process of buying more and more of this material, because there's of course a shortage. We faced this during the pandemic, that we couldn't even buy monitors anymore for an exhibition here in the museum. And how can we also, it's a question of time, right? Do we have time to think through and to replace those materials? Or do we always choose the fast way because it's so pressing to have it right here and right there all the time? So it's a different time pace that I think we need to work with, like inside institutions and outside institutions, to counteract that. So thanks a lot for sharing.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really, I think the museums should take the lead here. Yeah, but I know it didn't have a big budget, but I think it's possible. Yeah.
So next one is Raphael. Thank you for coming. Raphael Ara will be sharing his project, Ecological Oracle, which is currently on display at the Michigan State University Museum. And the piece explores the social dynamics of climate change, and in essence transforms the gallery into a microcosmos and simulation of climate impacts on future generations. And you are working at the nexus of complex systems and transdisciplinary design, arts-based research. And you are focusing, your work highlights the social, political, and economic implications of technology acceleration and human-to-machine interactions. So, Raphael, the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you for thank you all for attending and allowing me to share some work with you all for a few minutes. Let me share my screen briefly. Let's see. Okay. All right. You can see the main slides, right? Not the presented slides. Great. All right. So as introduced, I'll be talking about a new work. And in the spirit of new work, there's very many things that I don't have great documentation for yet, but I will share as the documentation that I have. But I'm delighted to tell you a little bit about this project, an ecological oracle, which is a time-based installation exploring the social dynamics of climate change. A little bit about me to just frame the work itself and my approach. So I'm Raphael. This is my second time sharing here at this festival. Last year, I presented at the Post-Sensorium Festival. I'm a designer, researcher, and artist who has primarily spent the bulk of my art practice in R&D spaces. So using art as a form of research in organizations, both for-profit and nonprofit, and using it as a vehicle to explore some of the systems that I'm exploring in a design standpoint, and using art as a unique lens to explore and feed back into the work of the organizations themselves. So that's a lot of how I frame my practice, especially for the past almost 10 years now. I got wind of this wonderful conference and event through the folks over at Leonardo, where I'm part of the governing board. And then I also am visiting faculty at the Pacific Northwest College of Art and the California Institute of the Arts. All right, so in my current organization, one project, been exploring how to support a global transition to a more equitable, ecological, and effective political economy, essentially. And so that undeniably has me exploring aspects of climate change and the impacts of humanity on the planet, how we can actually think through supporting the thriving and human flourishing, as well as the flourishing of the planet for in a regenerative way. So this came to a front really in 2021. Many of you are familiar with this IPCC report, which described that a 1.5 degrees Celsius increase in temperatures would be likely by the 2030s. What was interesting too is that this report also coincided with maybe glimpses of what a greener urban landscape might look like, especially in the Western world, in light of a lot of people having to work from home in the pandemic. So while the pandemic has been undeniably disastrous in many ways, it did bring some temporary environmental benefits. Pollution mitigation began to improve, car and industrial emissions dropped, and noise and light pollution actually improved. So these benefits, while temporary, coupled with this IPCC report, served really as a compelling point of reflection for me. So it's no doubt that we're in a climate emergency, and despite this threat of climate change, like many true wicked problems, there's really no definite formulation of the problem itself. No stopping rules to the crisis. Really, the best that we can do is manage it, because placing boundaries on the problem is quite difficult and quite challenging to do. And there isn't really a binary right, wrong, true or false, good or bad. So, and of course, climate change has become deeply politicized from a geopolitical standpoint, and is entangled with other issues like equity, which further exacerbates its effects and perhaps even increases the shortening timeline for us to combat global disaster. So this deep dive into this research material actually had me pondering a few fundamental questions. How might we proliferate some of the positive environmental changes in non-pandemic times? And would it make a difference? Or will we remain mired in what Mark Fisher calls capitalist realism, where we lack creativity, unable to look beyond the assumption of individual responsibility? So this ultimately led to this context behind an ecological oracle, which is a time-based installation that seeks to turn the gallery into a microcosm of the social dynamics at play in light of impending climate catastrophe. And so the installation engages participants in game-like dynamics where they need to self-organize throughout the course of the exhibition to maintain the dynamic equilibrium of the system. So the system exemplified here and really a short time-lapse video, which I'll explain in a moment. And it really asks some questions, mostly around, will a participant's sense of individualism and entitlement supersede their concern for the collective and future generations? And the intent of this experience is to conjure up feelings of perhaps ambivalence, indecisiveness, confusion, maybe even camaraderie or lack thereof. So to summarize, will we be able to self-organize to care for future generations? Or will we be mired in some of the incentives that capitalism places on us? So you all saw a time lapse of the physical sculptural part of the installation, but that this work hinges on this sculptural component that consists of two beakers that serve as a metaphor for ice levels on the planet. I showed you a slide at the very beginning for tipping points. So the beaker on the left, which is called R over there, represents the available water supply on the planet, R for reservoir. The beaker on the right starts empty and represents glacial melt, which I'll call M for short. And then nested within this M beaker is a smaller beaker full of red dyed liquid, which serves as a physical embodiment of all of the tipping points of climate change. And then there's a pump in between these two beakers that transfers water from one beaker to another based on the social dynamics of the space in which the installation exists. So as participants enter the space, the system monitors the number of individuals in the installation's vicinity. That serves as a proxy for urbanization. Similarly, the system monitors the total audible volume input from participants, which serves as a proxy for noise pollution. And both of these inputs are calibrated at the start of the exhibition so that any deviations from what it's calibrated for impacts the system accordingly. I should also mention the installation has an air quality sensor that captures CO2 as well as particulate count, and it's calibrated at the start of the installation. So any changes and fluctuations as to what that's calibrated for also has an impact. So for example, as these levels exceed the calibrated limits, water flows from the reservoir to the melt beaker, and then vice versa. As if those levels are under and far under the calibrated state, water will flow back from the melt beaker to the reservoir beaker, and the system will be in more of a regenerative balance. So the rate and the amount of flow corresponds to the magnitude of deviation. So, and then once, of course, the volume of water in this melt beaker actually reaches a certain level, it mixes with the tipping point. All of the water is dyed red, and you've kind of reached the point of no return. And so as a result, really any collective effort by participants in the space to combat the effects of climate change is thwarted. So participants really have, reached kind of a game over state in a way. And so to help guide participants in this, there's a multimedia visualization that accompanies the physical component of this installation behind it. On the left side of the visualization, participants are able to view data of what it's originally been calibrated for. And on the right-hand side, they're able to see the real-time data. And so, and then additionally, there is a visualization. This is a time-lapse prototype. So you can see as levels start to exceed calibrations, you'll get some distortion effects on the right-hand side of the blue marble, the globe, and also a real-time predictive assessment of when the tipping point will actually occur. So this helps provide a little bit of guidance to participants in the space. So to summarize the dynamics of this piece, it really is intended to serve as a parable of a subset of some of the social dynamics that are at play on a global level. Can participants self-organize in both short-term and long-term in order not to overwhelm the system? How much do smaller individual changes affect the greater whole? Similarly, what types of collaborations or maybe conflicts will arise as participants enter and exit the space and understand how the various inputs affect the system at large? Will participants try to account for future generations of the exhibition in order to allow them to experience the system? So all these questions are not unique to the gallery's experience itself, but really apply to the whole planet at large. And so something that's been quite compelling is to work with the piece, as was mentioned earlier, is up at display at the MSU Museum, which is formerly known as the Science Gallery Detroit, for an exhibition called 1.5 degrees Celsius. And it's up for 6 months. And so one of the interesting parts of this experience from just the artist standpoint has been to work with the gallery to determine how to calibrate the system, to determine the corresponding weights of the system, and trying to map that onto existing scientific data of climate modeling and how certain things like urbanization, noise pollution, air quality, how those things might have greater or lesser impact than others. And so that's been really quite compelling and interesting to explore in real time. So here are some photos from the exhibition. So you can see this is a still from the piece that is kind of currently hasn't reached a tipping point state yet, but is getting quite close. You can see some red indications on the bottom right with particulate value. The right-hand side of the globe is quite distorted. And then here is actually a point where the tipping point has been reached. And so there's quite a big visualization effect that ends up happening to really accentuate that, and then to also show that the tipping point has been reached, the pump turns off, and the system needs to be reset. So that's it. It's currently up on display for about 6 months. The exhibition closes at the end of February. If any of you happen to be in the Detroit area, I encourage you to see it. Thank you all very much. If you want to contact me to learn more, I'd be delighted to hear from you. And I will pause here for questions.
Thanks a lot, Raphael. Amazing work. And I think we can also connect to Megan's first presentation with performances and the body as also part of a larger system, and how it can trigger different points of departure. In your case, how to also make visible the climate crisis with such a tiny setup has a huge impact, and how you're showing that it's quite nicely. And it really reminds me also of that you managed to show the system of cybernetics basically on a performative scale, so that human beings become part of this feedback loop to keep this machine kind of running, which I like a lot. Are there any questions?
So I think one of the challenges when working with coding and AI that's come to a forefront recently is the way in which human assumptions of what constitutes a particular framework or entity kind of structure the code. So the way in which, facial recognition systems categorize Black people as gorillas occasionally, or don't necessarily account for different cultural differences in cultural differences and social norms and that sort of thing. And I wonder about how you're approaching or considering that in your work. So I think of levels of noise pollution and what's considered to be that while there's different ways that folks can work together to respond to a system, what constitutes a loud society versus a quiet society, for instance, just as a random thing, varies greatly from community to community. And so I wonder about how you think about those sorts of limits of coding or issues of inequity in those.
I love this question. So I can describe it for the installation itself, and then I can share my take on it at large. So for the installation itself, it's very context dependent, right? So depending on where it's installed, it's calibrated to different levels. So the science gallery a week before the opening, it was kind of like, hey, approximately, you know, working with them and thinking through like approximately how many people have come through exhibitions. Like, do you have historical data that can end up influencing or shaping the calibration state of it? So the piece itself is meant to serve as like this poetic abstraction, right? So it explores planetarity, but it also does it in a very community-based way. If you think about community in terms of the local context, I have there's an opportunity, for example, for me to do a more of a public art installation of it in an outdoor setting in Portland here. It'll be calibrated to entirely different things to reflect the corresponding levels of the Portland community and the urban versus indoor landscape. At large, though, I mean, I think you're hitting on a very, very important point, which brings me to, it reminds me of aspects of plurality in the pluriverse and how different kind of cosmologies can impact different ways of being in the world, and what does it mean? And there is no kind of right, wrong, true, false way of thinking about how many people are. Is it like a normal kind of what is considered like average, right? Or what is loud, what is not loud? How does noise pollution, or how does urbanization and CO2 and particulate count that is highly produced by the global north impact the global south? These are all pressing questions, and I mean, like, these are things that if I were to expand the piece and think about like just a different, and perhaps there is another piece to explore on this, because it is, or thinking about multiple sites of these pieces and how they might think about things in a fractal or holonic way. Because it's like, if you have an installation that is based in a very more culturally vibrant, loud community, and you have another installation that's in a library that's incredibly quiet, right? And so how do these two connect at this like global level? If you're starting to really try and really get some sort of aspect of planetarity and try to understand the climate crisis at this planetary scale, how are you considering those relative weights? So I don't know that I have an answer for you other than a lot of questions that I'm currently thinking about as well. But great question.
Thanks.
Of course.
Thank you, Raphael. We are going to Aurora. She's joining from Helsinki. Thank you for being here. You will speak about a very current topic, namely contamination. You are a multidisciplinary artist and a PhD candidate at the Aalto University, and your artistic practice investigates the relationship between humans and nature and how the perception of contaminated spaces influences the creation of reality. And you are interested in the space of potentiality that originates when definition is avoided or misplaced, and the liminal space of failure. The floor is yours, Aurora.
Thank you. And thank you for having me here. This is actually my second time at RIXC, one of the conferences I've been to. Can you hear me?
Yes, sure.
Yes. So one of the conferences I've been to was in June, the Southern More Than Humans Ecology Symposium. And so I'm sharing my screen. Do you see my presentation?
Yes.
Okay. So today I'm talking about radioactive contamination. And as you probably know, natural radioactivity is of cosmic origins. So cosmic rays come both from outside of the solar system and from the sun itself, where a process of nuclear fusion is converting hydrogen into helium. Natural radioactivity is also present in the Earth's crust since its formation. What we call radioactive contamination is instead a human-made outcome coming from artificially produced nuclear reactions. Contamination can happen from waste materials generated by the production of nuclear energy, from nuclear accidents which may occur in relation to this production, and from the testing or use of nuclear weapons. Radioactivity was accidentally discovered in 1896 by Becquerel, who was studying fluorescence and phosphorescence in minerals. And since then, much more research has been done. Especially research on quantum physics has been crucial in the discovery of radioactive energy as we know it today. This research was developed during the Second World War, and the main goal of the different parties involved in the conflict was to produce the atomic bomb to win the war. Political discourse about the use of radioactive energy has been and is still controversial. Nowadays, we fear an atomic war. After major nuclear accidents like those of Chernobyl in 1983 and Fukushima in 2011, among others, many countries decided to reduce or completely abolish nuclear production, while, following the debate on climate change, nuclear energy has been also seen as a possible green alternative to fossil fuels, of course not considering the problem of the generated radioactive waste, which we are now storing in Finland. We are building the ultimate storage place in Onkalo. We heard about Karen Barat in the presentation before. So in Meeting the Universe Halfway, Karen Barat talks about Michael Frayn's theater play on the famous Copenhagen meeting, which happened in 1941. There is no record of what was said during this meeting, but the two protagonists and pioneers of nuclear physics, Bohr and Heisenberg, are said to have ended their lifelong friendship. As you might know, Bohr was a Jew and was also Heisenberg's mentor. Heisenberg was working for Nazi Germany in the production of the atomic bomb. The dilemma of the meeting goes around what Heisenberg's intention was, which could not have been explicit due to the circumstances. So from Heisenberg's writing, as well as in the play, he wanted an answer to the question, does one as a physicist have the moral right to work on the practical exploitation of atomic energy? Bohr's understanding of what happened was different. Throughout his life, he had drafted several letters to Heisenberg, which he never sent. After the play, these documents were released from his family's archive to show Bohr's version to the public. Through these documents, it appeared that he was profoundly disturbed by the thought that Heisenberg had implied that Germany was about to win the war and wanted to dissuade him from working on the atomic bomb to avoid a possible atomic conflict. As a consequence of the changing political situation between Germany and Denmark, in 1943, Bohr had to leave the country, and later on, he joined the so-called Manhattan Project in Los Alamos, New Mexico, where the first atomic bomb was actually created, and Bohr made substantial contributions to it. Barat's book opens on this mysterious meeting to claim that the whole concept of intentionality needs to be rethought, because there is no such a thing as a single intention disconnected from its environment and its many entangled interrelations and diffracted patterns. So we heard earlier from Tagui's presentation that following Donna Haraway, Barat compares the scientific paradigm of reflection to a new way of understanding both matter and human thought through diffraction. Diffraction in physics is a phenomenon produced by the overlapping of waves one can observe, for example, in the water. Barat uses this example to rethink the notion of causality, so dear to the natural sciences, which presupposes that a cause generates an effect. When thinking through diffraction, there simply cannot be one single cause or one single outcome generated by a single action. Barat shows how everything, not just matter, but also human relationships and situations, can be acknowledged as forming patterns of entanglements and overlappings. The word contamination itself is also used by anthropologist Anat Singh to define a form of interrelation. The view that a single being or life form is an independent entity separate from its surroundings, which was determined by the paradigm of reflection objectivity, which presupposes a viewer placed outside of the observed situation, revealed itself as inaccurate. Bodies grow together in contaminated interrelations where organisms may be called multi-species landscapes. If we want to think and act differently from how we have been doing, which brought our planet to the actual state of pollution and radioactive danger, we need to give up certain thought forms, among others, the binary opposition of nature and culture, human and not human. I propose that what there is a longing for contamination, for overcoming the sense of finiteness of the body, for looking beyond the known, underneath the wish to research radioactive energy. I know this is a little bit controversial. I am looking at this issue through my artistic practice, through how mythological images and ancient traditions can bring about a different understanding of radioactive contamination, one that can be reached through an embodied knowledge. Myths has always helped mankind to make sense of the world, explaining it through symbolic narratives. But what is a myth? The definition of myth has blurred boundaries, which have been traced during the last century by scholars across different disciplines. Anthropologists have been studying mythology through what they have until recent times called archaic societies. And you can notice from the use of this term, this very division between primitive, archaic, and modern developed societies as coming from a history of colonialistic exploitation. But this concerns our history and the history of scientific research in general. In Myth and Reality, anthropologist Mircea Eliade describes how the notion of myth has been slowly deprived of its meaning of true story to signify fable, invention, or fiction. According to Eliade, myths, in contrast to those stories narrated through fairy tales, were indeed considered true stories. Myth reported the story of an origin, or creation, or of the world, of humans themselves, or of something important for humans to survive. Myths have the important social function of recalling a primordial origin. By re-narrating this origin or primary state, the myth is reiterated. Far from happening only in a remote past, they are reenacted and lived every time anew in the present moment. Myths are far more than stories or cautionary tales. They represent a very physical connection to the sacred or the supernatural. Myths are reiterated through rituals. My research is using a reappropriation and recreation of ritualistic practices as a way to bring about a different understanding of radioactive contamination. During the past year, I have been researching Latvian mythological image of the sun tree, Austras cox, as found in the Latvian Dainas, an ancient form of poetry transmitted orally through songs. My goal was to find a different understanding of radioactivity, one that could originate from a personal relationship with a natural mythical force, radioactivity as a psychic form. Saule, the sun in Latvian mythology, was said to travel across different dimensions of existence through the underworld and the world of the deities. The sun tree, or tree of dawn, is deemed to appear at the edge of the sun's path, or by bodies of water, which also symbolize portal-like connections to the underworld. The appearing of the tree is always connecting to the rising or setting of the sun. Often described as an oak tree, some of the songs describe it as a birch tree with 3 kinds of leaves or branches, where the sun and the deities rest or act. This image has been associated with the mythical word tree or axis mundi, a symbology that is repeated across different cultures. Currently, the Dainas are considered by most scholars to be related to pre-Christian period. Some elements of Latvian mythology are deemed to be linked to the Indo-European mythology. The history of the study of the Dainas has firstly defined notions like those regarding the path of the sun as nonsensical beliefs, supposedly because these notions could not be read through the Christian mythology. These are some examples of the Dainas describing the tree. I have recently found a peculiar article, and this is from a private institution. However, he has written something interesting. So the article is from Edgars Alskins and presents how the songs could be accurate descriptions of natural phenomena. Starting from the observation of the stars, they could be describing prehistoric catastrophes. So my open question and proposition to this conference is whether ancient mythological images and tradition can help us make sense of an existing longing for contamination, which could be a key to reimagine possible futures. And I will try to answer these questions by developing further this research through a participatory performance that will happen next month in Sabile in Latvia. So if you're in Latvia, you're all invited to take part in the workshop and performance. It is free of charge and open to everybody. Just drop me a line.
Thanks a lot. I would love to participate.
Nice.
We're a little bit running off time. The RIXC Gallery already announced that they will soon close the breakout sessions, but I really want that Tim also has the chance to share his presentation. So does someone has a question to Aurora?
I have many questions, but I'm worried about time, so I'm going to follow up with Aurora afterwards, but very exciting research. Thank you.
Thank you.
Cool. Glad that you connected.
Same here. So much.
So we are jumping back to Austria, namely to Linz, where the Cultural Research Organization Time's Up is based. And Tim is here with us. Thank you for joining.
Pleasure.
And their research is based upon constructing interactive situations, inviting an audience into them and encouraging their playful, experience-driven exploration of the space and its behaviors alone and in groups. And you're going to tackle the question, what will a world in the future look like? And you're going to beam us into the year of 2047.
Well, I'd like to thank you for that introduction. Yeah, firstly, thank you for the ability to be here. It would be really nice to be in Riga. I've been there a couple of times for various RIXC events and enjoyed them. I may drink a glass of black balsams tonight to celebrate the fact that I've been virtually in Riga today. And I'm hoping that the Zoom jitter that I've been suffering from won't get too problematic. I'm also reading from a forthcoming publication or a draft of it. So we'll see how that works. I'll try and show you some pictures and see how they work. Hopefully this is all very comprehensible. So I'm going to, oh no, I'm not. Sorry. This is going, oops, no. Hello, can you still hear me?
Yes.
Good. My images have all gone. Oh, what's happening here? No, I can see the pictures that I'm trying to show you, but you can't see them. That's not much good at all, is it? Let me just try this. Sorry, something's just gone wrong. We've been fighting technology all day. Let's see how badly this works out.
Yes, we see it.
Good. It's not meant to be like this. It's meant to be a lot nicer than this, but we will. Hello. There we go. That's what I'm starting off with. So, Feng Lin is a marine biologist, or at least she was. Now she runs a restaurant and a bar at the coastal city of Turnton. The city is somewhere on the European coastline in the year 2047. The bar is called Medusa, after the French word for jellyfish. Jellyfish are the largest creatures in the world, in the sea, as far as we know. Ecosystem collapse means that anoxia has killed anything that cannot leave the algal bloom. The Baltic is a mucky pool of rotting slime. Algal falls from the ocean surface to decompose in the anaerobic depths, turning back into the fossil fuel that helped create the heat and hypernutrition that created the scenario that fed the seas to grow the algae that fell to the depths. And on it goes. It's 2047. Feng has long given up on being a marine biologist. The bar used to sell fish and seafood from the local fisheries, but as stocks dwindled, fish were served for the last time. Jellyfish are the only things that remain as seafood on the menu. Her partner, Hamish Dornbirn, runs the nearby Ocean Recovery Farm. Farm operates in the entrances and in front of the harbours of Turnton. The fronds of seaweed filter the water around the harbour and lower the effects of storm surges, growing ever stronger as the ocean level rises. Absorbing nutrients, releasing oxygen, creating habitat. The seaweed farms, designed along regenerative and permaculture principles, protect the harbour, regenerate the water, and provide ecologically sound fertiliser and other resources. The Ocean Recovery Farm recreates versions of healthy, productive ecosystems as mergings of human intervention and natural ecosystems, an aquatic version of a small farm future. City of Turnton is filled with such characters, people living their everyday lives in a world that is so close but ever so far from the world of 2022. Scientists today are finding more and more signs of collapse, not only of climate systems, but also ecosystems, from the Baltic through the chemical analyses of Howard Dryden and the effects on plankton. Turnton, as a scenario, does not imagine that we, as a global culture, respond in time to escape the inevitable collapse of ecosystems. Turnton does not dwell on the ensuing pains and losses. Turnton proposes that we are not completely ignorant, and given the apocalyptic has occurred, we could perhaps respond with some utopian action. Turnton imagines the dance of utopian and dystopian visions held tight in an intertwined embrace. In this dance, how do we, as a society, as communities, as groups of friends, live? What is the mundane? What is the everyday in Turnton in 2047? So we have someone like Colin. Colin is a former maritime robot, made redundant through age and exposure to the aggressive elements of the sea. Colin is a bartender at the Medusa Bar. He's not always recognized as a robot. His stuttering voice module sometimes betrays him. In the situation we experience, patrons are celebrating his birthday. What does it mean to work with non-human systems? What does it mean to have a birthday for a robot? What happens when these machines, these non-human things, become colleagues, partners, and allies? How do we enjoy and celebrate the fact that we are sharing time and space across cultural differences, but also not only across cultural differences, but across species, phyla, and kingdoms? Turnton has become more than just a human community. Turnton is built as a physical narrative, a walk-through world fragment that invites exploration. In the same way that if I was left alone in your office, by looking at the back of the books on your bookshelves and the things that you've hung on the wall, I'd have some sort of idea of who it is that you are. When we create one of these worlds, it's a fragment of a possible future at one-to-one scale. There's a newspaper, a ferry timetable, a peephole into a factory, brochures, posters, and overhead conversations. All of these things combine to give us an idea of these fragments of possible futures. Turnton was initially imagined as part of a long futuring process in 2016. First fragment was shown at RIXC in autumn of 2016. And the core story world of Turnton has been elaborated by well over 100 co-creators. They've been writing stories for the newspaper, diaries and dialogues, creating posters for performances, festivals and conferences, music and instructions for systems that do not yet exist in today's world, but must take into account the dangers and opportunities of life in a climate and system change world. We contend, like the science fiction author Kim Stanley Robinson, that the future is an SF story that we're all co-writing together. This process of co-authoring is complex and problematic, filled with people who are unwilling to write their own part of the story, looking for the great man who's going to write it for them, unable to take their own interests and desires seriously. Our work with futuring exercises aims to overcome this by demonstrating to people that they can create, along with a group of other people, usually strangers, a coherent, surprising, and worthwhile vision of a possible future in quite some detail. Being guided through a process that enables combinatorial thinking and co-creative development, participants are playfully exploring in a structured context. From our own experiences, we know that this can be a game changer. Thinking out loud about possible futures is enabling in that sort of sense. Expressing what one finds interesting, saying yes and to someone else's expressions, what they find interesting, following ideas to their ridiculous endpoints. Futuring is a powerful way to develop and to enjoy new modes of thought. So Jim Dator is one
Tim? No, he freezed again. No.
To determine whether a given thing could be actually real and to be able to know what is real. In addition, Musil talks about a Möglichkeitssinn, a sense of what is possible. As you can read the quote yourself, but the Möglichkeitssinn should be defined as the ability to think everything that could be just as well, and not to take what is as more important than what isn't or isn't yet. Many people have had a Möglichkeitssinn that has been hampered by too much practicality, you've got to get a job, or has been squeezed out by social pressures to be agreeable. If you express your Möglichkeitssinn too much, you might be a little bit annoying. When social dreaming, leaving practicalities behind and doing the things that are just possible, is at some stage more important as leaving desires behind and just thinking about what we want to happen. We should not just spend our time imagining utopia, because not only utopia, but also dystopias and all the topias in between are worthy of reflection. We are reminded that utopia can be a reference direction, but is not a very nice place to be. Also that we're living in a utopia now, just not our utopia. Dreams are, by their nature, somewhat incoherent. They are rather like a mind's attempt to create a kind of order from the melange of imagery in the brain. Similarly, we build the social dreaming process to bring a group of people together around making sense of a shared, inconsistent, and incoherent collection of hopes and aspirations, their images of a desired future and states of being. More diverse ideas and images of possible futures emerge through this social dreaming process. The creation of a vision through open, enthusiastic sharing of images of complementary extrapolation and the improvised is not a coherent, complete representation of a perfect world. While certain elements are finely developed and detailed, as you saw from the pictures before, in order to support the explorations of visitors to the space, other aspects are left completely undecided. This is a Mut zur Lücke, a courage of the gap, and is undertaken in order to allow the visitor to imagine their own details into this world. We do not rely upon the existence or non-existence of the European in the Turton story world. It is compatible with either one of these things, its existence or non-existence. Thus, we can't really talk about the euro, whether it exists or not. And thus, any mention of currencies in turn would be a problem. So we unask the question of currency. We just don't mention currencies, leaving that aspect to be decided by each visitor for themselves as they feel the need. Our basic premise is that we can encourage futures thinking by helping people into the mindset through direct experience. We repeat that I hear futures and I forget. I see futures and I remember. I do futures and I understand. This understanding helps us think about and think out loud about what kinds of futures we want to live in together, to move beyond the simplistic desires for more and more of the same, and to avoid the confusion of quantity with quality. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim.
Hopefully get that in before they want to close us down.
You have been frozen sometimes, but it was quite a nice cliffhanger sometimes. So we were we were waiting for you to come back to the present from the future.
I'm glad I came back a few times and stayed on the whole time.
I'm wondering how many people are working at the moment in this collective or for this specific fiction story that you just read out loud.
Well, when we talk about the core team, there's about half a dozen of us who turn up regularly. But the number of people who've helped build the fragments of Turton that we've presented so far, I think the current list of compatriots is about 170 people.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that includes actors and architects, and it includes designers and drawers and writers and all sorts of things. It's been fantastic working with people. And this idea of the future is something that we create together, like each one of these people is helping to create the world of Turton. is very much like the way we are all creating the future that we're going to be living in together. I'm very interested.
Yeah. I really like the quote that you put in your abstract, that we are all co-writing together. We would like to claim that we had a better start sharing our first or second draft. So we can write a better story together. Future is a verb and a skill. We need our exercise. I like this a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, well, I think I mentioned it at some point, but maybe it got lost in the one of the gaps. Is we were introduced to the idea of futuring as a verb, future as a verb, like the thing that you can do, by our colleagues at FOAM in Brussels, and this idea that it's possible to guide a group of people to explore what they imagine as a good future is a very good idea. And by doing this verb, by doing futuring more often, you sort of exercise your future muscles, so to speak. It's really nice just seeing the way that people around us are beginning to learn to use this more, and we are as well.
Yeah, and I think this also fits quite nicely to the hacking society, which always also happening on the fringe, and it's always a collective work that is happening and bringing so many people together and also make it more accessible. And I think also your immersive installation storytelling are very inclusive. It's not like in a museum exhibition in that sense, right? You are telling a huge story behind it.
Thanks. Yes. This is something that's been quite nice. I recently was laughed at slightly by a very old friend who says that we don't like this whole communicating arts field, but that we've started creating work that explicitly creates communication of itself very well. And so this has been a really nice change. And we've had people tell us, the people who work in museums, that it's just so easy to communicate this work because it communicates itself, and they can actually start, rather than having to talk about the work and then talk about with a group about how to think about it more, they can just start talking about how we can think about it. It's a really nice development.
Exactly. And also because the audience is like, with all the senses involved, it's not like only looking at something, but it's also like different stations where you need to explore, and in order to get like to the next room, kind of a quest that you have to follow.
Yeah, and this is a lot of fun.
Nice.
People come up with questions and then they move to the next space that begins to answer them and ask different questions. And we were lucky, we used some living systems in what we've done. For instance, we used a whole bunch of bamboo to demonstrate liveness, and that actually brought an olfactory, like a smell sense, and even like the dampness of the bamboo in the exhibition space helped change the entire like bodily perception of being in there. And that was really nice. If you think about Central Europe as a place that's got a sort of a steamy feeling, like in an Asian country, then that makes the experience of climate change much more immediate. It's all of a sudden just what happens if Paris feels like Shanghai?
True. Yeah, interesting.
A really interesting thing. So our colleagues at Superflux did something similar, where rather than talking about the numbers of air pollution in a city, they actually created the smell of that future city. And whereas the numbers didn't mean anything to the politicians and decision makers, once they smelt what the city would smell like in the future, they're like, we have to fix this.
Yeah. So it's also coming back to more than human sensing, right? And implementing this into the art field, which technology enables or enhances it. But I mean, it's maybe already enough to work like with smell, with perfumes, or with creating it. Yeah, it's very nice.
We did do some work where we tried to do some things with an arts-based perfume manufacturer, which was really interesting. But we found that the use of actual materials and letting them do their natural processes somehow made the smell less intrusive, but also more convincing. So it's sort of because the actual objects that you were seeing in the space were creating the smell. Interestingly, that with a perfume thing, but that process of thinking about how smell in that environment could work was really interesting, because it made us think more explicitly about what that could be, what would be the olfactory sensation of being in that possible future.
Yeah, But it also triggers memories, not only future scenarios, right?
Yes,
It's
and
like a back and forth all the time.
I think this idea that smell goes straight to our brain through our noses and makes something else happen is really powerful.
Yeah.
I think it would be really interesting to work more with this sort of thing, to find out more aspects of what's going on with with this effect of smell, but also proprioception. This thing you're saying, like walking through the space, because you're embedded in the space, that adds a different thing. It means, of course, on the other side, it's very hard to document this because a photograph of a smell doesn't work. And a photograph of a space that's all about the feeling of being inside it and the dimensions of it is also very hard to, it doesn't really work as a photograph, which is...
Well, this is a future challenge, of course, yeah.
It's been all our work, and will continue to be, and we'll carry on doing the things we do, even if we can't document them well.
Thanks a lot, Tim. It was amazing.
Pleasure.
Does someone else has inputs, questions? Okay. This was an intense panel. It was quite a race, but I'm so happy that everyone had the chance to share their wonderful work. And there were so many crossovers in the end that I really enjoyed. And I hope you also just now stay in touch and connect to each other. Thank you, RIXC Gallery. Sorry for stretching the time. And I hope I can all see you somewhere in the physical or hybrid space soon. Enjoy your evening or morning or whatever. And see you soon.